The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Broken Arrow Ranch, sending up clouds of dust that hung in the dry September air like a veil between worlds. Eleanor Whitmore stepped down onto the sun-baked earth, her fine Boston boots already coated in the grit of this desolate territory. She clutched her carpetbag with white knuckles, refusing to let the tremor in her hands show. Behind her, the driver tossed down her trunk without ceremony, and the horses stamped impatiently, eager to be away from this place that felt like the edge of civilization itself. She had been sent here as punishment. That much had been made abundantly clear by her stepmother's cold smile as she'd handed Eleanor the train tickets 3 weeks ago. You need to learn humility, girl. Your father's sister will teach you what it means to work for your keep. Perhaps a summer on that dreadful ranch will cure you of your willful spirit. The words still stung like a slap, delivered in the parlor of the Philadelphia mansion that had been her home until her father's death 2 years prior. Everything had changed then. Her stepmother had wasted no time asserting control, and Eleanor, at 19, had found herself powerless against the woman's machinations. The ranch house squatted low against the horizon, a weathered structure of rough, hewn timber and sun-bleached paint. Somewhere behind it, cattle lowed mournfully. The smell of manure and hay and something wild and untamed filled Eleanor's nostrils, so different from the perfumed drawing rooms and manicured gardens she'd known. A woman emerged from the house, broad-shouldered and stern-faced, wiping her hands on a stained apron. Aunt Margaret looked nothing like Eleanor's gentle father. Where he had been soft-spoken and kind, his sister was all sharp angles and harder edges. So you've finally arrived. Aunt Margaret's eyes raked over Eleanor's traveling dress, the delicate lace collar, the impractical buttons. We'll see how long those fancy clothes last out here. There was no embrace, no word of welcome. Just a curt nod toward the house. Supper's at 6. You'll sleep in the room off the kitchen. Tomorrow you start earning your keep. That first night, Eleanor lay awake on a narrow cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier. Coyotes howled in the distance. The wind moved through the eaves with a lonesome whistle. Through the thin walls, she could hear the ranch hands talking in low voices as they settled in the bunkhouse. She had never felt so alone, so completely cast adrift from everything she'd known. Tears slid down her temples into her hair, silent and bitter. The next morning began before dawn. Aunt Margaret shook her awake roughly, thrust a plain work dress at her, and told her to be in the kitchen in 10 minutes. Eleanor dressed with fumbling fingers, her body aching from the hard mattress and the weeks of travel. In the kitchen, she found herself facing a mountain of breakfast preparations. Biscuits to be made, bacon to be fried, coffee to be brewed for a dozen hungry men. She had never cooked a meal in her life. In Philadelphia, they'd had a cook, a housekeeper, maids. Her hands had been meant for piano keys and embroidery hoops, not cast iron skillets and bread dough. She burned the first batch of biscuits. The bacon came out raw in the middle. The coffee was so weak it looked like dishwater. When the ranch hands filed in for breakfast, their faces told her everything she needed to know. Some snickered behind their hands. Others exchanged knowing glances. Aunt Margaret stood in the corner, arms crossed, a tight smile playing at her lips. This was exactly what she'd wanted. Humiliation. Proof that Eleanor Whitmore, with all her refined manners and education, was useless in the real world. But there was one man who didn't laugh. He sat at the far end of the long table, away from the others, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was older than the other hands, perhaps 35, with sun, weathered skin and hands scarred from hard labor. He ate what was put in front of him without complaint, even the half-raw bacon, even the charred biscuits. When his eyes met Eleanor's across the room, she saw something there that stopped her breath. Not pity, exactly. Something deeper. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition of pain that mirrored his own. His name was Thomas Brennan, she learned. The other hands called him Tom, though rarely to his face. He'd been working at Broken Arrow for 5 years, longer than anyone else. He was the best horseman they had, the one they called on for the most dangerous work, breaking wild mustangs or tracking down strayed cattle in the roughest country. but he never joined in their evening card games or their bawdy songs. He never spoke unless spoken to directly, and even then his answers came in as few words as possible. Some said he'd been a soldier once, down in Texas. Others whispered that he'd killed a man in a gunfight and come north to escape his past. Whatever the truth, Thomas Brennan carried his silence like armor, keeping the world at a careful distance. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and small humiliations. Eleanor's soft hands blistered and bled from hauling water, scrubbing floors, beating rugs in the yard. Aunt Margaret seemed to take pleasure in assigning her the hardest, dirtiest tasks. Mucking out stalls, plucking chickens, hauling slop to the pigs. The other ranch hands watched with barely concealed amusement. The fancy city girl was learning her place, they said. Serves her right, coming out here with her airs and graces. But Thomas never watched with amusement. Sometimes Eleanor would feel his eyes on her as she struggled with a bucket that was too heavy, or stumbled carrying an armload of firewood. Once, when she nearly collapsed from the heat while hanging laundry, she looked up to find a dipper of cold water waiting on the fence post beside her. No one was around, but she knew somehow that it had been him. 3 weeks into her exile, Eleanor was in the barn attempting to fork hay down from the loft. The pitchfork was unwieldy in her blistered hands, and the hay was packed more tightly than she'd expected. She struggled with it, tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. When she heard boots on the ladder behind her, Thomas appeared at the top of the ladder, moving with easy grace despite his size. Without a word, he took the pitchfork from her hands and began forking the hay down with practiced efficiency. "You don't have to," Eleanor said, her voice rough. She hadn't spoken much to anyone in days. What was the point? No one wanted to hear what she had to say. Thomas paused, leaning on the pitchfork. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his weathered face she saw something that made her want to weep. "I know what it's like," he said quietly. "Being somewhere you don't belong. Being where folks want you to fail." Before she could respond, he'd gone back to work, moving the hay with swift, sure movements. When he was done, he descended the ladder and walked away without waiting for thanks. But something had shifted between them in that moment. A door had opened, just a crack. After that, Thomas began to appear whenever Eleanor faced a task that was beyond her. He never announced himself, never made a show of helping. He would simply be there, wordlessly taking a heavy bucket from her hands or showing her a better way to mend a fence. The other hands noticed, but said nothing. Nobody questioned Thomas Brennan, not even to mock him for helping the city girl. There was something about him that commanded a careful respect, like approaching a wild animal that might bolt or bite if startled. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Eleanor found Thomas in the corral with a young horse. The animal was clearly traumatized, shying away from any approach, eyes rolling white with fear. Thomas stood in the center of the corral, utterly still, barely seeming to breathe. He didn't try to catch the horse or corner it. He simply waited, patient as stone. Eleanor leaned against the fence rail, watching, forgetting for a moment her aching feet and raw hands. After nearly half an hour, the horse took a tentative step toward Thomas. Then another. Finally, it stretched out its neck and sniffed his outstretched hand. Thomas's voice, when he spoke, was so soft Eleanor almost couldn't hear it. "That's it. Nobody's going to hurt you. I know you've been hurt before. I know you're scared, but you're safe now." The horse allowed Thomas to stroke its neck, then its shoulder. Eleanor watched, mesmerized, as man and animal stood together in the dying light, both of them healing something in that moment of gentle contact. When Thomas finally left the corral, he found Eleanor still watching. Their eyes met, and this time she didn't look away. "What happened to him?" she asked, meaning the horse. Thomas closed the gate carefully. Previous owner beat him. Thought fear was the way to train an animal. Some men are like that. They think breaking something is the same as making it strong. Eleanor's throat tightened. She thought of her stepmother's cruelty, the casual way she'd wielded her power. The deliberate humiliation of sending Eleanor here, not to build character, but to crush her spirit, Is that what they're trying to do to me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Break me. Thomas's jaw tightened. He looked out at the darkening prairie, at the endless sweep of land and sky. I think, he said slowly, that some people can't stand to see others stand tall. Makes them feel small, I reckon. So they try to cut everyone down to their size. They stood together in silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, like promises being made by the night sky. Eleanor felt something unfurl in her chest, something that had been wound tight with fear and shame since her father's death. For the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone. The weeks turned into months. Summer's brutal heat gave way to the crisp clarity of autumn. Eleanor's hands grew calloused, her arms stronger. She learned to bake bread that didn't burn, to fry bacon that was crisp and perfect, to haul water without spilling half of it. But more than that, she learned the rhythms of ranch life, the satisfaction of hard work done well, the peace that came with physical exhaustion and clean air and wide, open spaces. The humiliation her stepmother and aunt had intended became instead a kind of liberation. Here, away from society's expectations and drawing room manners, Eleanor discovered parts of herself she'd never known existed. And through it all, Thomas was there. Not hovering, not intruding, but present. A steady, silent presence that asked nothing and offered everything. They began to talk during those stolen moments, when their work brought them together. Short conversations at first, carefully neutral. The weather, the cattle, the state of the fences. But gradually, carefully, they revealed more. Thomas told her about Texas, about growing up the son of a poor farmer, about joining the army during the border conflicts. He'd seen things there, he said, his eyes going distant. Things that still woke him in the night. He'd killed men, good men and bad men, and he'd watched friends die in his arms. When it was over, he'd come north, looking for silence, looking for a place where the ghosts couldn't follow. Eleanor told him about her father, about the happy childhood that had ended so abruptly with his death, about the stepmother who'd seen her as an inconvenience, a reminder of the first wife who'd been so beloved, about the systematic stripping away of her inheritance, her independence, her sense of worth, about being sent here with the explicit hope that she would fail, would beg to be allowed to return home, chastened and compliant. We're both running from something, Thomas observed one day. They were riding the fence line, checking for brakes. Eleanor had learned to ride in the past months, and though she'd never have Thomas's easy grace in the saddle, she could stay on a horse now without fear. Maybe, Eleanor said, or maybe we're running toward something. We just don't know what yet. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. When had he become so important to her? When had his rare smile become the thing she looked forward to most in her day? When had the sound of his voice become the music she most wanted to hear? But Thomas looked away, his face closing like a door swinging shut. Can't run toward what you can't have, he said, his voice rough. Can't reach for what's beyond you. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that nothing was beyond reach if you wanted it badly enough. But the words died in her throat. What did she want? What was she willing to reach for? A few months ago, she would have said she wanted to return to her old life, to reclaim her position in Philadelphia society. But now, the thought of going back to that gilded cage made her feel suffocated. October brought the first hard frost. The ranch prepared for winter, slaughtering cattle for meat, reinforcing buildings against the coming snow, laying in supplies that would have to last until spring. Eleanor worked alongside everyone else. Her city, girl weakness burned away by months of labor and sun. She barely recognized herself in the cracked mirror in her tiny room. Her skin was tanned, her hair sun-streaked, her frame leaner and stronger. But it was her eyes that showed the biggest change. They no longer held the wounded, confused look of a girl who'd lost her place in the world. Now they held the steady gaze of a woman who'd found her strength. Aunt Margaret noticed the change too, and it seemed to anger her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Eleanor was supposed to break, to become docile and grateful and desperate to leave. Instead, She'd bloomed like a wildflower in rocky soil, finding nourishment where none was intended. The work that was meant to humiliate had instead built her up. The isolation meant to crush her had given her space to discover who she really was. "You'll be leaving soon," Aunt Margaret said one morning over breakfast, her tone sharp. "Your stepmother's written. She expects you back before Christmas. Says you've learned your lesson." Eleanor's hand stilled over the bread dough she was kneading. Back to Philadelphia. Back to the stepmother who hated her. Back to a life of meaningless social calls and stifling expectations. Back to being powerless and controlled. The thought made her physically ill. She looked up and found Thomas watching her from his place at the table. His face was carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Fear, perhaps. Or hope. Or both. "What if I don't want to go?" Eleanor heard herself say. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Aunt Margaret's face went red. "Don't want to go. Girl, you've got no choice in the matter. Your stepmother is your legal guardian. You'll do as you're told." "I'm 19, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "In most territories, that's old enough to make my own choices. Old enough to work for wages, to sign contracts. Old enough to decide my own future." The room had gone silent. Every ranch hand was watching now, forks frozen halfway to mouths. Aunt Margaret stood from her chair, looming over Eleanor. "You ungrateful little fool. After everything we've done for you, providing you with room and board, teaching you the value of honest work." Eleanor met her aunt's eyes without flinching. "You didn't provide me with anything. You worked me like an unpaid servant, hoping to break my spirit and send me home crying. But it didn't work. I'm stronger now than I've ever been, and I have this ranch to thank for it. This place, this work, these people." She gestured around the room. "They've shown me what I'm capable of." Thomas stood then, his chair scraping back. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried a weight that made everyone listen. "The girl's right. She's of age. She can choose her own path. And if she wants to stay, well, this ranch could use another capable hand. We're short-staffed as it is." Aunt Margaret rounded on him. "You keep out of this, Brennan. This is family business." "With respect, Thomas said, not backing down an inch. "Seems to me you've been treating her more like hired help than family." Can't have it both ways. The standoff lasted a long moment, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Finally, Aunt Margaret threw down her dish towel and stormed from the room. The ranch hands slowly returned to their breakfast, but Eleanor could feel the shift in how they looked at her. She wasn't the fancy city girl anymore, the object of mockery and scorn. She'd stood up for herself, claimed her place. She'd earned something she hadn't had before: respect. After breakfast, Eleanor found Thomas in the barn, checking on the horses. She approached slowly, her heart in her throat. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Stand up for me like that." Thomas didn't turn around, but his hand stilled on the bridle he was mending. "Because," he said quietly, "someone needed to. And because I know what it's like to be pushed into a corner. Told you have no choice, no voice, no future. I've been that person. Hell, some days I still am." Eleanor moved closer, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched. "Thomas," she said softly, "look at me." He turned slowly, and the vulnerability in his eyes nearly undid her. Here was a man who'd spent years building walls, keeping everyone at a distance, protecting himself from hurt. But something about her had gotten through those defenses. Or perhaps something about them together had created a space where walls weren't necessary. "I don't know what I'm doing," Eleanor admitted. "I don't know if staying here is the right choice or a crazy one. I don't know if I can really make a life in this place. But I know that going back to Philadelphia feels like dying, and I know that you've become the most important person in my world. Somehow, without either of us meaning for it to happen, you've become my home." Thomas's hand came up, trembling slightly, and touched her cheek with a gentleness that belied his calloused fingers. "I'm not a man who has much to offer," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've got a past full of darkness and a future that's uncertain at best. I've got scars inside and out, and some days I'm not sure I'm fit company for anyone." Eleanor covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. I'm not looking for perfection, Thomas. I'm looking for truth. For someone who sees me as I really am and doesn't look away. You've given me that from the start, even when I was at my worst, even when I was burning biscuits and falling apart. You looked at me and saw something worth saving. A sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. You saved yourself, Eleanor. I just held the door open. They came together then, in the dusty half light of the barn, with horses stamping softly in their stalls, and the smell of hay and leather surrounding them. The kiss was tentative at first, then deeper, more certain. It tasted like promise and possibility, like two broken people discovering they could be whole together. The next weeks were complicated. Aunt Margaret refused to speak to Eleanor directly, communicating through terse notes and indirect commands. Letters arrived from Philadelphia, each one more demanding and threatening than the last. The stepmother threatened to cut off Eleanor's small inheritance, to ruin her reputation, to see her destitute and begging in the streets. But Eleanor stood firm. She'd found something here that mattered more than money or social position. She'd found herself, and she'd found a man who saw value in the person she'd become. Winter came hard and fast, blanketing the ranch in snow that stretched to the horizons. The work became about survival, keeping the stock fed, the pipes from freezing, the houses warm. Eleanor proved herself again and again, working alongside the men in brutal cold, never complaining, never backing down. Slowly, even Aunt Margaret began to soften. If not in affection, then at least in grudging acceptance. The girl had grit, she told Thomas one day. I'll give her that. She's got her father's stubbornness. Thomas and Eleanor's relationship deepened through the long winter months. They talked for hours by the fire, after everyone else had gone to bed, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Thomas told her about the war, about the things that still haunted him, the faces he saw in nightmares. Eleanor told him about the loneliness of her childhood, the pressure to be perfect, the pain of losing the one parent who truly loved her. They gave each other their broken pieces, trusting that together they could build something new and whole. One February evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Thomas took Eleanor's hand. I never thought I'd want to ask anyone this, he said. Never thought I'd be brave enough or foolish enough. But loving you has made me want to be brave. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple band of silver, hammered smooth by his own hands. It's not much, he said. Nothing like what you're probably used to. But if you'll have me, if you'll take a chance on a broken, down cowboy with more past than future, I'd be honored to call you my wife. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of coming home. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. I don't want a fancy ring or a society wedding, or any of the things I used to think mattered. I want you, Thomas. I want this life we're building together. I want every sunrise and every storm, every hard day and every small victory. I want all of it, as long as it's with you. They married in the spring, in a small ceremony at the ranch with the hands as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, and Thomas wore his Sunday best, nervous as a colt in his clean collar. There were wildflowers on the table and fiddle music for dancing, and even Aunt Margaret smiled just a little, watching her niece marry a good man who would love her fiercely and protect her always. The letter that arrived from Philadelphia that summer was brief and cold. Eleanor's stepmother had remarried, a wealthy banker twice her age, and wanted nothing more to do with her troublesome stepdaughter. She was washing her hands of the whole affair, she wrote. Eleanor was on her own now, for better or worse. Eleanor read the letter once, then fed it to the stove fire, watching the paper curl and blacken. She felt no anger, no regret, just a sense of finality, of one chapter ending and another beginning. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. You all right? He asked softly. More than all right, Eleanor said, leaning back into his warmth. I'm free, and she was. Free from the expectations that had bound her, free from the cruelty of those who'd tried to break her, free from the gilded cage of her old life. She'd been sent to the ranch to be humiliated, to learn her place, to be crushed into submission. Instead, she'd found her strength, her purpose, her home. She'd found a man who saw the pain in her eyes and met it with his own, who understood that healing didn't mean forgetting, but rather learning to carry your scars with grace. The years that followed weren't easy. Ranch life never was. There were droughts and harsh winters, cattle lost to disease, lean times when they scraped by on hope and determination. But there were good years too. Years when the calves were fat and the grass was high and the work felt less like survival and more like building something lasting. Eleanor and Thomas worked side by side, partners in every sense, building a life from the ground up. They had children, 3 of them, tough and sun-browned and fearless. Eleanor taught them to read from her father's books, carefully preserved and carried west. Thomas taught them to ride, to respect the land, to treat animals with kindness and strength in equal measure. The children grew up knowing their mother had been a fine lady once, in a city far away, but that she'd chosen this life, this land, these people. They grew up knowing their father carried ghosts, but never let them define him. They grew up understanding that strength came not from never falling, but from getting up every time you did. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, Eleanor and Thomas would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the prairie. They'd hold hands, these 2 wounded souls who'd found each other in the unlikeliest of places, and they'd marvel at the strange grace that had brought them together. She'd been sent here to be broken, but instead she'd been remade. He'd been running from his past, but instead he'd found a future worth fighting for. The ranch thrived under their care. Word spread of the couple who treated their animals with gentleness, and their workers with respect, who paid fair wages and kept their word. People came from miles around to buy horses trained by Thomas Brennan, who had a gift for healing broken spirits, both equine and human. Eleanor became known for her hospitality, for welcoming strangers with food and warmth, for seeing people as they were rather than judging them for where they'd been. And when Aunt Margaret passed, in her sleep on a cold winter night, she left the ranch to Eleanor and Thomas. It surprised everyone, including them. But in the will, she'd written a single line that explained everything. She proved me wrong. She belonged here all along. Eleanor and Thomas stood at the graveside as the preacher said his words, holding hands in the spring wind. They'd forgiven Margaret long ago for her cruelty, understanding that she'd been shaped by her own hurts and disappointments. They buried her on a hillside overlooking the land she'd loved, marked with a simple stone. That evening, standing on the porch of the house that was now truly theirs, Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, taking a chance on a broken city girl who couldn't even fry bacon. Thomas's arm tightened around her. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "You taught me that broken doesn't mean worthless. That pain can become strength. That love is braver than fear." Eleanor smiled, watching their children play in the yard, their laughter carried on the wind. "You taught me those things too," she said. "We taught each other. And that, in the end, was the truth of it. 2 wounded people, sent to the edge of the world by circumstance and pain, had found each other and built something beautiful from their broken pieces. The ranch that was meant to humiliate Eleanor had instead given her everything that mattered: purpose, strength, family, love. The silence that Thomas had wrapped himself in had been broken by a woman who saw past his walls to the gentle heart beneath. They'd both been running, both been hurting, both been lost. But in finding each other, in choosing to stay, in having the courage to build a life from dust and determination, they discovered something that no amount of wealth or social position could ever provide. They'd found home. Not a place on a map, but a feeling. The sense of being known, fully and completely, and loved anyway. The joy of waking each morning beside someone who made you want to be braver, kinder, stronger. The peace of working toward a shared future, one day at a time, one small victory at a time. The sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the prairie in colors too beautiful for words. Thomas and Eleanor stood together, 2 figures silhouetted against the dying light, and watched another day come to its end. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new joys and sorrows. But they'd face it together. As they'd faced everything since that first morning, in the kitchen when their eyes had met across a plate of burned biscuits. They'd face it with love, with courage, with the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving the worst and choosing, always choosing, to hope for better. And in the distance, a horse whinnied. The cattle settled for the night. A coyote called to the rising moon. The prairie breathed with the eternal rhythm of life continuing, always continuing, beautiful and harsh and utterly real. This was the Wild West, unforgiving and magnificent, where people came to hide or to heal, or to reinvent themselves entirely. Where a woman could be sent to be broken, and instead find herself remade. Where a silent cowboy could see the pain in someone's eyes, and recognize it as a mirror of his own. Where love could grow in the hardest soil, taking root against all odds, blooming into something that would last lifetimes. Eleanor squeezed Thomas's hand, and he squeezed back, and no words were needed. They'd said everything that mattered long ago, in glances across a coral, in quiet moments of shared understanding, in the decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. They'd said it in every sunrise they'd greeted together, every storm they'd weathered, every small kindness they'd shown each other when the world felt too hard. The stars began to appear, one by one, ancient light from distant fires. Eleanor had learned their names from Thomas, who'd learned them from an old cowhand years ago. Cassiopeia, Orion, the North Star that never moved, constant and true. They were the same stars that had shone over her old life in Philadelphia, but here they seemed brighter, more real, more meaningful. Here, under this vast sky, she understood her place in the world, not as something assigned by society or family, but as something she'd claimed for herself. Here, she was exactly who she was meant to be. And as the night deepened, and the temperature dropped, and they finally went inside to the warmth of the house they'd made into a home, Eleanor Brennan thought about the girl she'd been when she'd stepped off that stagecoach so many years ago. That frightened, humiliated girl who'd thought her life was ending. If she could go back and tell that girl what lay ahead, would she believe it? Would she understand that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing? That being sent away in disgrace could become the start of your real life. That the silent cowboy who saw your pain would become your greatest love, your truest partner, your home. Probably not, Eleanor thought with a smile. Some things you had to live to understand. Some gifts came wrapped in such ugly paper you almost threw them away without opening them. Some blessings looked like curses until enough time had passed to reveal their true nature. She'd been sent to the ranch to be humiliated. But the silent cowboy had seen the pain in her eyes and offered her something infinitely more valuable than pity. He'd offered her recognition, respect, and eventually love. He'd offered her a chance to become who she really was, stripped of pretense and social expectations. And she'd taken that chance, had grabbed it with both blistered hands and held on through every storm. Now, decades later, with silver threading through her hair and grandchildren, playing in the yard where her own children once played, Eleanor understood that she'd never been sent here as punishment at all. She'd been sent here to find herself, to discover her strength, to learn what really mattered. The people who'd meant to break her had actually set her free. And the silent cowboy who'd seen her pain had given her the greatest gift of all, the space to heal, the courage to stay, and a love that had lasted through every season of their lives together. As Thomas banked the fire for the night, and Eleanor checked that the doors were locked, she caught sight of him in the lamplight. His weathered face still handsome to her eyes, his steady hands still capable of such gentleness. He looked up, caught her watching, and smiled. That rare, beautiful smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Nothing. How lucky I am. How strange life is, the way it takes you where you need to go even when you're fighting against it every step of the way." Thomas crossed the room and took her in his arms, and they stood together in their kitchen, in their house, on their land, surrounded by everything they'd built together. Lucky, he agreed. That's one word for it. I'd say blessed. I'd say saved. I'd say we found each other right when we both needed finding most. And Eleanor, who'd once been a fine lady in Philadelphia, who'd been sent west to learn humility, but had instead learned courage, who'd met a silent cowboy and discovered that the quietest people often have the most to say, laid her head against her husband's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. That sound had become the soundtrack of her life, as familiar and necessary as breathing. It was the sound of home, of safety, of love that had weathered every test and emerged stronger. Outside, the prairie stretched into darkness, vast and wild and beautiful. Inside, two people who'd once been broken stood whole in each other's arms, proof that sometimes the cruelest intentions lead to the most unexpected grace. They'd been forged in fire, tested by hardship, and they'd emerged as something stronger than either could have been alone. They were partners, lovers, friends, parents, ranchers, survivors. They were living proof that you could be sent to the edge of the world and discover it was actually the center of everything that mattered. And when they finally climbed the stairs to their bedroom, when they lay down in the bed they'd shared for all these years, when Thomas's arms came around Eleanor in the darkness and she felt the familiar warmth of his body against hers, she whispered the same prayer she'd whispered every night since their wedding day. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving all the broken pieces until they became whole. Thomas's voice came back, soft and sure in the darkness. Thank you for letting me. Thank you for choosing this life. Thank you for teaching me that home isn't a place. It's a person. It's us. And with those words wrapping around them like a blanket, they drifted into sleep. Two souls who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life from dust and determination and stubborn, enduring love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new moments of joy and sorrow. But they'd face it together, as they always had, as they always would, until the last sunset faded and the last star fell. Together, in this wild and beautiful place, where a woman had been sent to be humiliated, but had instead found everything worth living for. Together, in the arms of the silent cowboy who'd seen the pain in her eyes, and had answered it with understanding, with patience, with love that asked for nothing and gave everything. This was their story. This was their truth. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.